Hello, it's Gene Tunney here. Today I'd like to talk to you about what's been happening with GST revenue and how that affects Queensland. So last week we had the budget updates from the Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and the State Treasurer Cameron Dick. The federal government update was much more comprehensive than the state government update. There's still a lot we don't know about exactly what's going on with Queensland, but it was a good start from Cameron Dick to release what he did. One of the things we learned, other than the fact that we're going to have some big deficits and a lot more debt, we learned a little bit about what's been driving the blowout in the deficits and the increase in debt. One of the points that was made in Cameron Dick's media release was that over the 2019, 20 and 2021 financial years, GST receipts to Queensland will be cut by up to $2.5 billion compared to our MIFA estimate. So MIFA is the mid-year fiscal and economic review, and that was the last comprehensive budget update we had from the state government. That was released in December. So $2.5 billion over 2 financial years have been lost from GST receipts. And when I spoke with Beck Levingston on 612 ABC Brisbane on Friday, she asked me about this. And Beck asked whether other states have been affected. And I said, well, yes, because the federal government collects GST on behalf of the states. And so the states and territories are going to be affected according to their share of that GST pool. So $65 to $70 billion of GST is collected, substantially less last financial year and this financial year than normal because of the economic downturn associated with COVID-19. So I had to tell Beck that there's a methodology that's administered by the Grants Commission which determines the shares of the states and territories in the GST pool. That methodology is going to be adjusted a little bit from next financial year so that there aren't such big swings in revenues to particular states, to grants revenues, particularly to WA, which because of fluctuations in commodity prices, its share of the GST revenue has fluctuated wildly, and it's ended up getting, I think at one time it was in the 30 to 40 cents for every dollar of GST that would have been raised in WA. So they're going to tweak that methodology. But let's have a look at the methodology as it is at the moment. This is a table from the MyEFO, so the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook, produced by the Federal Treasury last December. And what that shows is how the amount of GST entitlement for the different states and territories is determined. And it's based, broadly speaking, on the population share modified by what they call a relativity. And the relativity is designed, or it's a calculation of how much the state or territory should receive in excess of or less than its population share, to take into account the fact that it has greater expenditure responsibilities. So Queensland will argue that we have to spend more per capita because of our more diverse state, because we're having to build roads across vast areas of Queensland, for example, or we have a higher share of Indigenous people in our total population. The relativity will also take into account the state's revenue raising ability. And so these relativities this second column here, that's the calculation of the relativity. What we see here in the first column is the estimated population. So for Queensland, 5.1 million. And in this relativity column, we've got the relativity is 1.0537. So to determine our share of the total GST pool, we're multiplying our population by that 1.0537 to get this adjusted population in column 3, and we're determining the share of the GST pool based on that adjusted population over the total population estimate here. What we see with Queensland for 1920 was that we're a beneficiary of this redistribution process. So in Queensland, we're benefiting from this Grants Commission redistribution, and it so happens that because of our perceived expenditure needs, the fact that we do have this vast state, we have a higher proportion of Indigenous people, also to an extent our property prices are not as high as in other states, and so that would affect our ability to raise revenue from stamp duty, I believe, that, and land tax. I think that must be one of the other reasons. But it hasn't always been the case that Queensland has been above 1 with its relativity. I think it was about 10 years ago or so, after the mining boom. So when we were in that mining boom and we had high commodity prices, that ended up affecting our relativity, and for a time that relativity was below 1, in which case we were losing out from this Grants Commission process, and other states were getting money from Queensland. But generally, Queensland has been, on average, a beneficiary of this process. Okay, so that's how that's determined. What's interesting here is that the GST is a substantial component of total state government revenue, as are other grants from the Commonwealth. And there are issues with this that I'll discuss in a moment. But let's have a quick look at the data. And these are the estimates from 2018-19. In that year, we saw that grants revenue, the bulk of which is from the Commonwealth, that was nearly half of total Queensland government revenue in that financial year. And of that 28.3 billion in grants revenue, of that total, we have about, of the Commonwealth component, there's around, it's about half and half as the GST entitlement, and half of it are special purpose payments or payments for specific purposes, the bulk of which are for health and education. Okay, so in December 2019, when the state government released its mid-year fiscal and economic review, in 2019-20 it was expecting those payments for specific purposes to be around $13 billion and the GST entitlement to be $14 billion. Now, we know that the GST entitlement is going to be much, substantially less than that. That's what Cameron Dick was announcing in his press release. And the way I explained it to Beck Levingston on ABC the other day was that we know from Josh Frydenberg's budget update that GST revenue in 2019-20 was down 5.9 billion. So if you take a bit over 20% of that, you get a bit over $1 billion. And Josh Frydenberg announced that for 2020-21, GST revenue is down 7.6 billion. So again, take a bit over 20% of that. You'll get nearly $1.5 billion. Actually, you'll get more than $1.5 billion if I do the calculation properly. And so that's how Cameron Dick has announced, that's why he's announced that Queensland expects to lose up to $2.5 billion last financial year and this financial year, 2020-21. So that explains that. So let's talk a bit about the fact that the state government is so dependent, well, all the state governments are so dependent upon the Commonwealth. This has long been seen as a problem. It's been seen as a problem as long as I've been studying economics. There was a lot written about this in the 1990s, I recall, by Cliff Walsh at a Centre for Fiscal Federalism, if I remember the name correctly, at ANU. Actually, it was a Federalism Research Centre at the Research School of Social Sciences at ANU. And there was a lot written about this problem of vertical fiscal imbalance, which is viewed as problematic because it blurs accountabilities. The state governments spend much more than the revenue that they raise themselves. This is Malcolm Turnbull's autobiography, and he devotes a section on this problem in his autobiography, which I highly recommend. It's in a chapter on tax reform. And I'll quote from Turnbull's autobiography. One of the biggest problems in our federation is that almost half of the money the states spend is raised by the federal government. In 2017-18, the states and territories spent $263 billion, of which $120 billion came from Canberra, and $63 billion of that was the proceeds of the GST. This unsatisfactory state of affairs is called vertical fiscal imbalance, and it produces a lot of moral hazard. A state premier can complain the feds aren't giving them enough for schools or hospitals or infrastructure. But then if the feds try to find more money by raising taxes, they're pilloried, often by the very same state premier. Turnbull's right to identify this as a problem. Now, he proposed one solution to this, or part solution to this, back in 2016. And I remember that I was asked about it by Steve Austin on his radio show back in 2016, and I was supportive of the PM's idea. Unfortunately, the state premiers didn't go along with it, and Turnbull backed off. The passage in Turnbull's book where he describes what happened is illuminating and pretty funny. So I'll just read the relevant passage. Looking for a new tax policy that could deliver real reform, we decided to propose to the state premiers that we'd identify a share of income tax that would be handed over to them and that they'd be able to increase or lower their rate of tax. So this is an idea that goes back to the Fraser government, if I remember correctly, that the states would be given part of the income tax, and then they could vary that. So there could be some competition between states on that basis. And if states wanted to spend more, then they could raise the income tax in their state. This is where it gets rather amusing. Turnbull writes, when I pursued the proposal with the premiers directly and collectively at a dinner at the Lodge on 31 March, the Labor premiers were all outright opposed. Anastasia Palaszczuk said that coming to Canberra for money was too good to pass up. It suits us perfectly. We get all the credit for spending the money and you get all the blame for raising it. And when we can't spend enough, we blame you. Well played, Premier. I think that that nicely illustrates the problem we have with vertical fiscal imbalance. I'm not criticising the Premier. I think that's a logical thing to say from our state Premier. But it does show the nature of the problem. Okay. Thanks for listening. I hope you found that informative, and I hope to chat with you again soon about topical economic and fiscal issues. Thank you.